All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my friend Rebecca Burns. Rebecca is a reporter and assistant editor for In These Times magazine, which you can find at inthesetimes.com. You can also follow her on Twitter at REJBurns. Rebecca, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
All right, so Rebecca, you recently wrote about a proposed bill in Illinois that would essentially privatize evictions. Why don't you tell us all about it?
Right. So this was a bill introduced by a legislator who's also sort of a small-time landlord herself into the Illinois General Assembly that really sort of set off a panic in the housing advocacy community because, as you said, what it would do is essentially privatize the eviction process. So as is in Illinois and really in almost every other state, evictions can only be carried out by the sheriff, and there's sort of a set procedure where, folks facing evictions may consult with a social worker. There are a number of legal protections throughout the process. What this bill proposed to do is to allow any peace officer, so that could include, off-duty cops, but it's a very broad term that could even include some other categories of just state officials, to carry out these evictions. So essentially the landlord could retain, a police officer who works in the suburbs and wants to kind of moonlight with this kind of work on weekends to evict tenants. It would also sort of place new legal restrictions on the number of motions that tenants can file to delay their eviction. So, for example, disabled tenants who need more time to move, someone who says there's been some kind of irregularity or oversight in the legal process leading up to an eviction order being placed against them had these safeguards. This would essentially limit those and really speed up evictions effectively.
Well, it's one of these things that's like, wow, this really seems like a horrible bill. I mean, it's like let's make the eviction process easier for landlords and kick people out of apartments faster. Talk a little bit about the person who proposed it. It's gotten through committee as well. Tell us a little bit about the person who proposed it, because as you said, she also owns she's not a giant landlord, but she has a bunch of rental properties. Do you think she just had some kind of personal vendetta against somebody that she wants out of her own apartment, or what's the deal behind this?
Sure. So that's exactly what it appears was going on. Illinois legislator named Monique D. Davis has been in the House of Representatives, I think, for more than a decade now. Essentially, initially filed this bill in the winter. So, in Chicago, as well as in other places, as we all remember, it was a bitterly cold winter, and generally a moratorium on evictions is placed when it's less than 15 degrees, kind of, quite obviously with the thinking behind that being that it's very dangerous, potentially deadly to put people out on the street when it gets that cold. So Davis's initial version of the bill would have just removed the weather provision, so required the sheriff's office to enforce eviction orders, basically no matter how cold it was. And she herself has said to the press, to me, that one of her tenants, who she tried over and over to get evicted during the winter, the sheriff's office was unable to carry that out because of this moratorium against carrying out evictions when it was below 15 degrees. So this does appear quite literally to have started out of sort of a landlord who owns, I found at least like 5 or 6 buildings. She didn't sort of want to acknowledge to me when I spoke to her how many buildings she rents out, but public records show that she owns a number on the south side of Chicago. So there's definitely some personal interest there that she has in speeding up the eviction process. Really the concern that a lot of advocates had about this kind of bill, there's also a similar bill working its way through the California Assembly right now, is that in addition to small-time landlords like Davis, who also happens to be a legislator, there are a lot of big institutional landlords, these sort of investors turned landlords that I and other folks have been covering, for whom this kind of bill, would really work in their advantage to sort of gain control of large swaths of the housing stock in cities recovering from the foreclosure crisis.
Well, again, we'll get to the Wall Street angle of this, because we actually had you on the show, I think in April, talking about one of those groups, which was Blackstone. Mm-hmm. But I want to kind of reiterate. So in Illinois, there is a part of the eviction law currently that you're not going to evict somebody if the temperature is below 15 degrees. That seems to be a very rational and humane thing to do. It seems like the very least, I would probably even go, maybe below 20, maybe even below freezing. Maybe we can wait a little bit on that. But this congresswoman, this Illinois House member, is so determined. No. If you want to evict somebody when it's below 15 degrees, if it's below 0, go ahead, toss them out there. She's perfectly fine with that. In fact, she thinks that's the problem with these evictions, is the fact that we can't toss people out of the street when it's below 15 degrees. That is really part of this bill.
Yes, absolutely. People initially dubbed it the polar evictions bill, and that was, it was introduced in February. When I spoke to Representative Davis, she sort of, was complaining quite openly about how behind the sheriff's office was on evictions this winter. And, anyone who works in housing advocacy tenants will say, that's probably a good thing, given that it was a record cold winter where folks were literally freezing to death.
So and again, just seems to be another area where because this is eviction is essentially, it is a law enforcement operation. That is what it is. It seems that this is another area where if you are privatizing it and you are adding even a further profit motive to this, that just seems to be opening it up to all types of abuse. I mean, right now, it's horrible enough that in this economy, where so many people are unemployed, people can't afford to even make their payments, that people are getting kicked out of their homes. And after the foreclosure, the mortgage crisis of 2008, you could go on, right? But like the fact that there's so many evictions going on, period. But the fact that they want to even, add another layer of people making money off of this, like another middleman to grab a little extra cash off of this is pretty insidious.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to stress that it's not as though the eviction process, is always fair and just and gives tenants. This is really a situation of things going, from bad to worse or from terrible to terribler. And one of the things we saw with this bill is that the Cook County Sheriff, who certainly housing activists in Chicago have not generally worked in coalition with. They've been sort of targeting him to push him to do more, to put a moratorium on foreclosure evictions. But around this bill, we sort of saw a situation or an example of strange bedfellows where the sheriff's office was coming out and saying, this would be a nightmare. This would have unthinkable consequences. You can't place the authority to carry out evictions with people who have a financial stake in the process. That's absolutely contrary to all of the reforms that have been made, over the past several decades. So we when you have a situation of both office that carries out evictions and those that are regularly opposing them, saying, we'll work together to ensure that we don't have a situation where landlords can just sort of hire someone to put their tenant at a gunpoint, you sort of really see how much this would change to the current process for the worse.